Hey everyone, I hope you're having a beautiful day and an amazing holiday season, and thank you so much for joining me today for another art video. Throughout the past few months, I've had a few of my amazing viewers here on YouTube reach out and ask me for videos on tips and tutorials on watercolor pencils. Many of them have come across my channel because a long time ago I shared one video on this very versatile drawing/painting medium in which I compare watercolor paint to watercolor pencils. So if that's interesting to you, make sure to check it out. I'm going to be leaving a link to that very old video down below in the description box. So for today's video, I decided to finally get out my watercolor pencils again and create a little something with them. So watercolor pencils are essentially sticks of watercolor pigment that has been encased in wood in the form of a pencil. They are a very versatile medium, and it basically combines drawing and painting into one. And what's so interesting about this medium is that we can really use them in a variety of different ways. And the way that you go about using this medium is really going to depend on your particular way of working, what you enjoy doing, as well as the effects that you want in your final outcome. It allows us to combine both very painterly and or more smooth effects or gradients with texture or details or even marks that color pencils allow. This particular video is not going to be a full out tutorial just yet because I really wanted to focus on getting a grasp on the medium myself before actually sharing a tutorial with you guys. But I am going to be walking you through in general terms what I did here for this yellow rose, and will also be providing you some tips at the end that will help, especially if you're just getting started with this medium. All right, before getting started with the walkthrough, I just want to send out a huge warm welcome to everyone that is new here at my channel. I am super happy that you found me, and do consider subscribing because every single week I share new videos with art tips, drawing and painting tutorials, and encouragement for aspiring artists. And if you do subscribe, don't forget to click on that little notification bell so that YouTube can let you know whenever I publish a new video. Otherwise, you may or may not find out about it. And I also want to send out a huge thank you to everyone that has subscribed to my channel here on YouTube. It means the world to me. Thank you for your likes. Thank you for your comments, because all of these interactions really help support the work I'm doing here at my channel. Okay, so the first thing that I did for this study was I looked for an excellent reference picture to work from that would allow me to really be able to pinpoint highlights, midtones, and darks quite easily, as well as allow me to gain a better understanding of the form, the structure of the rose itself, the shapes of the petals, and the different elements involved. And then what I did is, with my reference picture open in front of me on my computer screen, I sketched out my rose freehand on a piece of drawing paper. Once that preliminary outline sketch was at a point at which I liked it and it showed believable proportions and everything like that, that is when I used a piece of tracing paper to transfer my outline sketch onto my sheet of watercolor paper. I decided to do this in this case because I wanted to keep my watercolor paper protected, and I didn't want to erase again and again and again on it. I did do some final refinements using my HB pencil right on my watercolor paper after the transferring had been done, but it was very, very minor. Now, in terms of starting to add in the color, you're gonna see that I used basically two different general techniques here. One of these techniques is basically going right in directly using my watercolor pencil on my watercolor paper, and then going in with a slightly dampened brush and softening everything out. And the second technique that you're gonna see me use quite a bit is I am creating a mixing palette on a piece of watercolor paper by scribbling some of my color on a scrap piece of watercolor paper and going in with a slightly dampened watercolor paintbrush and bringing the pigment from there right onto my painting. I layer these techniques on top of each other until I achieve the results that I want. I do make sure to bring in the experience that I have gained with painting with regular watercolor paint in terms of making sure that I'm not damaging or overworking my paper, because I find that when I am working with watercolor pencils, It's very easy to be tougher on your watercolor paper because you sometimes can scratch the watercolor paper with your pointy pencil tips, or you can also do too much scribbling or too much scrubbing on your paper, and this can be very damaging. So I do make sure to stay conscious throughout the process and just make sure that I'm allowing certain areas to dry completely before I try to go back in and further darken it or add more details or anything like that, because wet paper is fragile paper, and even when it comes to watercolor paper, you have to remember that it can only take so much. With this watercolor rose, I got started with the first technique that I described. So I use my watercolor pencils right on my watercolor paper straight away directly. Using very gentle strokes and not pressing down on my watercolor paper very hard at all, I start laying down my layers of watercolor pencil. Taking into account the lights, the midtones, and the darks that I was able to perceive in my reference picture, I started laying down lighter and darker greens, lighter and darker yellows/oranges, etc. Just as if I were using regular colored pencils. I did, however, make sure to stay away from areas of lightest lights or highlights because I want to keep these areas of watercolor paper protected. When it comes to painting with regular watercolors or even watercolor pencils, I do my best to have the whiteness of the paper stand in for my highlights. So I want to make sure that I have a good sense of where my highlights are since before getting started with the painting process, and I do my best to work around them throughout the painting process, because once the pigment starts getting absorbed into watercolor paper, you're never going to go back to the whiteness the paper once had. I don't really like adding in a second medium on top of my watercolor at the end. I really like making sure that I am protecting my highlights since the beginning. This is, of course, a complete matter of preference. It's just how I personally like doing things. As I have shared in past videos, I always love taking a few minutes to prepare the colors that I'm going to be using for my pieces. And this one was really no exception. So I had a couple of different greens already prepared, a couple of different yellows, and I already had in mind what colors I wanted for my background, as well as what kind of colors to bring in to create my darkest darks and my cast shadow color mixtures. I even took time to swatch out different colors, as well as have a look at how different colors looked when combined before actually getting started with my painting. And this is something that I highly recommend, especially if you just bought a new paint or watercolor pencil set. And this will really help you minimize the muddy colors and just negative surprises that might come up. In terms of how I am moving forward, I am basically using the same general method that I use when I work with regular watercolors, which is work in layers from lighter and more translucent colors towards darker and more saturated colors. I am just staying patient and slowly, incrementally developing that sense of three-dimensional form. And even though my paper here, when I am working with watercolor pencils, dries much faster than when I am working with regular watercolor, because with regular watercolor I tend to use much more water, I still jump around from area to area because I really make sure that I am allowing each area to dry completely before going back in and attempting to add more detail or further washes of color. Okay, so I keep working in layers until I arrive at a sense of three-dimensional form that I like, and I really play by ear and choose whether I want to go straight in with my watercolor pencil or use my impromptu paint mixing palette, depending on how much texture I want to leave in that particular area. And this, once again, is completely up to you and your preferences. Okay, you guys, so watercolor pencils are definitely a very practical and versatile medium. There's virtually no cleanup involved. You can carry them around anywhere, and they also allow for much more control. We can also use them in so many different ways and so many different techniques that I'm gonna make sure to go into more in future videos, so do make sure to stay tuned. They are so much fun because you can really bring in your artistic style if you like things to look more textured or smoother. They just allow for so much play and we're able to create very interesting effects. Okay, so just to finish up, I'd love to share 5 tips with you guys that are getting started with this medium, and these are definitely going to help you achieve better results and just struggle less throughout the process. Tip number 1 is to make sure that you're using watercolor paper. It's important to use paper that is intended for water-soluble mediums. I would recommend at least 140 pound or up. Also, make sure that you're keeping your watercolor paper protected as much as possible throughout the process. Make sure that you're not scratching it with the tips of your pencils or overworking it too much with scribbling or scrubbing. Tip number 2 is to make sure that your preliminary outline sketch that you create prior to starting with your painting process is very light, especially if you don't want your pencil lines to show through your paint. I like using an HB pencil, but you can also use a harder pencil grade. Just make sure that you're drawing lightly, and you can also pick up some of your pencil lead using something like a kneaded eraser or a soft rubber eraser like I did in the beginning of this video to make sure that your sketch is nice and light before you start with your painting process. Another option could be to actually create that preliminary sketch straight on your watercolor paper using a watercolor pencil, and this way most of your line work would disappear when you start adding water. Tip number 3 is to take time to plan your colors before starting to paint. Think of the different color variations that you're going to be creating for your highlights, your midtones, and your darks, what color mixtures you're going to be using for your cast shadows, what colors you're going to be using for your background that is going to really enhance your focal point or your subject. I would highly recommend keeping things limited and avoiding randomly picking colors throughout the process, as well as taking time to swatch out colors if you don't know them already and test out your color mixtures. Tip number 4 is to use a good reference photo, especially if you're looking for higher levels of realism, and make sure that you are pinpointing highlights, midtones, and darks so that you're better able to protect those highlights throughout the process and you're more easily able to develop a sense of three-dimensional form, because value is what creates a sense of three-dimensional form. And my 5th and final tip is going to be to give thought to the kinds of effects that you want to create in each area of your painting before actually starting. Because watercolor pencils allow for so many different types of effects, ranging from very, very textured, especially if you're using a very rough watercolor paper, to very, very smooth effects depending on the quality of the watercolor pencils that you're using and also the type of paper that you're using. It can be very easy to get lost along the way and end up with a kind of effect that you didn't initially want. So giving thought to the techniques that you're going to be using and when and where you're going to be using each throughout the process is going to give you a basic guideline and is going to make it much more possible for you to end up with something that you like. Alright, you guys, that is it for today. I really hope that you enjoyed this video and that you found it helpful and inspiring. If you have any further questions, make sure to leave them down below for me in the comment section. I'd absolutely love to hear from you. I'd love to know which you prefer, if you prefer watercolor pencils or regular watercolor paint, and why. I'm gonna leave you a couple of helpful videos right here that you can feel free to check out next. Thank you guys so very much for watching. I really appreciate it. I would love to get a like if you enjoyed this video because it really helps my channel get in front of more people. Don't forget to subscribe and talk to you soon.